Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Mighty Modern. I'm Corbin Hostler, and this is Living End. Living End is a pretty fun modern deck. It's been around forever. This is the first deck I ever built for competitive tournaments back in Extended. Forever ago, I actually made it to the finals of PTQ with this deck back then, and that was before Modern existed. Now Modern does exist, and Living End has always been a thing. I think it's made the finals of a Grand Prix or two, maybe won one, but either way, definitely has some top eights under a belt. And it just got a shot in the arm with Amonkhet. The reason is more cycling. So we were able to cut some of the excess cyclers, the ones that were a little less bad, and we have better, more powerful cards now. So what does this deck want to do? It wants to cast its namesake, Living End. This is one of those. It's Living Death. If you guys know what that card is, it's a card that when it resolves, basically you sacrifice all creatures in play and put all creatures in the graveyard into play. You sort of exchange the two. It's got a lot of words that basically say exchange the two. So you want to cast this card. Of course, now this is one of those time spiral cards that doesn't have an easy way to cast it. You have to suspend it for 3 and wait 3 turns to resolve it, unless you have a way to cheat it into play. So that's where Violent Outburst and Demonic Dread come in. Both of these cards have Cascade. That means as soon as you cast them, you reveal cards from the top of your deck until you hit a card with lesser converted mana cost, and you can play it for free. Now, the trick is, in this deck, you can only hit Living End. So as long as you cast one of these 2 spells, you're going to hit a Living End. And then if Living End resolves, you will exchange the graveyards and what you have in play. Now, in order to make that really good, what this deck has is a bunch of cycling creatures. And what we're able to do with Amonkhet is remove some of the slower, not quite as powerful ones, and just fill the deck with the most power and the cheapest cycling costs. And that's Desert Ceradon, 1 mana, 6/4. 6 power for 1 mana cycling. Horror of the Broken Lands, 4 power, 1 mana to cycle, and it can get bigger if you have the ability to cycle once it's in play. And then you have the staples that are already in the deck, your Architects of Will, your Monstrous Carabids, and your Street Race, all of which can cycle for free or cheap. And then the other addition is Archfiend of Ilfnir. So this card's really powerful. I think maybe 2 is a correct number, but we're going to run with 3 because it's new. Basically, the deck wants, in my opinion, as few expensive cyclers as possible. You just want to cycle for 1 mana on turn 1, cycle for 1 mana on turn 2, twice, and then resolve Living End on turn 3. And that's generally enough to kill a few creatures and put, 12 power or whatever into play on your side. And that'll go a long way most of the time. Of course, lots of different things can happen, but that's sort of, your ideal start, right? So cycling for 2 mana can be a lot worse. But I think that Archfiend is worth it because sometimes the deck gets into games where you just need to cast the cards from your hand for mana, and this is obviously insane. It's a 5/4 flyer. Also, there are occasionally stalemates where you will have Resolve Living End, but your opponent isn't dead, and you don't just have an overwhelming board presence. And that's where Archfiend shines, because you just cycle another card, and all of a sudden you just shrinking their entire team. So very, very powerful card coming in from Amonkhet. Rounding out the deck, we have Fulminator Mage, which is obviously very, very good. You play Fulminator Mage on turn 3, you destroy one of their lands, you bring it back later with Living End. Same thing with Beast Within. You can use it to blow up one of their lands, and then you'll immediately just give them a beast, but that'll get sacrificed to the Living End. And then Very Macabre, flyer that can remove creatures from their graveyard, deals with Kitchen Finks, annoying, actually pretty decent against combo decks. Overall, you can discard it from your hand. It's sort of another free way to cycle as well. Or rather, to get a creature in your graveyard, not cycle. That's the deck. What you won't see here, and I'm not sure how correct it is or isn't, is Karizev's Expertise, which allows you to cast a Living End out of your hand for free. Because the converted mana cost is 0, and Karizev's Expertise allows you to cost a 2 or less casting cost card. I'm not running that here. I think it's not needed. I think that now that your cycling is more efficient and more powerful, the 7 Cascade spells you already ran are fine. We also don't have Simian Spirit Guides or Avalanche Riders, which were a staple in some of the old lists. The games where you could go turn 2 Fulminator Mage off a Simian Spirit Guide, or Fulminator Mage into Avalanche Rider and just blow up all their lands. Those games felt really good, but also Avalanche Rider just costs a lot of mana. It's 4 mana. There's no way to cheat it into play. You just have to get there. And Simian Spirit Guide, while very powerful, and it was very important in some matchups, also my opinion is a little bit of a crutch. Now that the deck is more more efficient. You don't need it. You going off on turn 3 is good enough. You don't need to go off on turn 2. You don't necessarily need to cycle another creature earlier because your cycling is more efficient and you get more power out of it when you do. Now there are certainly games where you want it, especially against combo decks or something like that, where you just want to turbo out Fulminator Mages. So you will feel it a little bit, but what we lose in explosiveness there, we make up for in even more consistency by just having a bunch of cyclers. So that's the deck we're going to roll with. After that, you just have a basic mana base for the 3 colors. I also haven't dipped into blue for Curator of Mysteries or As Foretold or anything like that. You deal yourself a bunch of damage that way in a deck that already deals itself damage. It's just not needed. Moving on to the sideboard, the Shriek Launch used to be in the main deck. Now they're in the sideboard. You bring them in against Scavenging Ooze decks, or really any creature decks. It works fine because it's a 2-mana removal spell when you evoke it, and then it'll come back later and kill a creature. Ravenous Traps, since we can't play anything that costs 1 or 2 mana, because then we might hit it off of our Cascade spells, we have to play cards that cost 3 or more. And that means no Surgical, no Graph. Graph Digger's Cage, for what it's worth, actually doesn't do anything against Living End because of the way the card is worded. Living End actually exiles the cards from the graveyard, then puts them into play. So Graph Digger's Cage doesn't stop it. So, but obviously we can't play that either against the Collected Company decks or anything like that because of the restriction we have to play with. So Ravenous Trap is our graveyard hate of choice. If it's basically for dredge, but you can also sometimes pay 4 mana if you need to. Anger of the Gods sweeps away the Kitchen Finks decks, the Scavenging Ooze decks. It's just a very good card on its own. Affinity, things like that. Ingot Chewers exists for affinity, Lantern Control. Again, Evoke, doing a lot of work here. Ricochet Trap. This is a really fun one. This is what you bring in against a counterspell deck. Because Remand, if you Violent Outburst and they Remand your Living End, it goes back to your hand. You have to suspend it. That's terrible for you. But Ricochet Trap meets the requirement of going in our deck because it's not less than 3, but you can pay just 1 red and essentially counters a counterspell by redirecting the target of the counterspell to Ricochet Trap itself, which of course counters the spell in resolution, allows your Living End to resolve. Outside of that, Slaughter Games for the combo matchups, Burn the Boar and Gnaw to the Bone for burn. Gnaw to the Bone gain you a bunch of life if you can find it. Burn the Boar, similar but different. They sort of fill the same role in different ways. Burn the Boar can sacrifice, gain 4 life at instant speed, bring it back with your Living End. So that's a deck, and it's a lot of fun, and I think it's really well positioned right now. It has a lot of play against Death Shadow, for instance, which can make you discard everything in your hand, but almost everything you draw at that point is a cycler, so it helps you dig to the cards you need. And it's already very well positioned against a bunch of creature decks. So, Living End, here we go.